The man got up and stood in front of her and began to ask her to tell Jinwoo about her ability. She turned around and began to say that it must be hard to believe, and the other hunters thought exactly the same thing. However, once you experience my power, all doubts will disappear. She found herself even closer to Jinwoo and began to say, with a calm, intense tone, since he already knew every awakened person had a limit and no one was capable of overcoming it, in other words, once he isn't awakened, he can never increase his rank again. She paused, then continued with a confident expression. It turns out that she has the power to help awakened hunters break their shackles, but she has to go through 3 stages to do so. Nevertheless, she is confident that she can call her ability forced reawakenings. The man who was standing beside her began to speak, his tone serious. Everything said to her was true. However, such a power requires a large expenditure of magical energy, so reawakening only comes to a few people, not more. Jinwoo reflected thoughtfully. He was also among them, and furthermore, if he wasn't telling the truth, such an ability was quite useful. He began to ask her with curiosity how effective it was. The girl replied that it depends on the person, but after going through the 3 stages and improving by at least 20%, or maybe even 30%, to Jinwoo, this was unbelievable. He began to understand with growing amazement why Hunter Hwang Dong-soo decided to go to America despite all the criticism, and who in their right mind would turn down such an opportunity. Any other hunter would want to be in his shoes. A sense of urgency crept into the conversation as the man began to say that this is why she is being looked after, and they have taken responsibility for her life, as well as paying some money as compensation. The risk is great, but this is the only way Mrs. Sellner can help raise the level of their chosen hunters. And it can be said that her ability is their gift to Jinwoo. Jinwoo started to say with a skeptical smile that it's not a gift, but more like a bargain than a gift, or is he wrong? But the man responded earnestly that if he becomes a U.S. hunter, they will no doubt help him over his limit. In addition, he will be able to join any guild he wants. Thus, these were very favorable terms for the contract, but there was no need to rush. They invited him today, so he himself joked about somehow being awakened again. The man's voice softened slightly. The boys are not his gift, and Mrs. Sellner was right. He then asked Jinwoo with an almost reverent tone if he wanted to try to go through with it, and he could take it as a gesture of reverence on their part. But Jinwoo hesitated, his expression uncertain. It seemed to him that she was saying once you experience it, power for yourself, you won't be able to stop, and apparently this woman is quite confident. She took Jinwoo's hand and started telling him firmly to look carefully into her eyes, and she started the first step. The man who was sitting next to her realized with satisfaction that this was Jinwoo now in their hands. He thought to himself, I'm the one who's so cold and aloof right now, he thought. And once he experiences the power, he'll immediately come to them and maybe even sign a contract with them right now. At that moment, in some dark place, she began to look around with growing unease, and soon in the pitch darkness, she saw Jinwoo's face peeking out from afar. Terror seized her, and she started screaming loudly. The men standing behind Jinwoo immediately reacted, pulling out their guns and aiming them at him, shouting urgently what he had done to Mrs. Sellner. Another hunter standing nearby began yelling at them, his voice sharp, to quickly hide their weapons. After all, they had probably forgotten who was in front of them. He approached them, then continued in a tense, reproachful tone that they were just outwardly idiots. If they were so worried, they should just check on her condition. He apologized to Jinwoo and added with embarrassment that their agents had behaved a bit improperly. Jinwoo, still sitting on the couch, looked on, confused. The man didn't calm down and continued in an exasperated tone that if they put on such a show in front of Thomas or Jagan, they alone wouldn't be left with a wet spot. They should get that into their heads. Meanwhile, Mrs. Sellner was holding her head, trembling with fear. The man who approached her asked with a worried expression what was wrong with her, for she was sweating profusely. He realized that she wasn't feeling well and spoke in a calm, concerned voice that she didn't look well today and suggested to continue the conversation another time. Jinwoo stood up, saying reassuringly that it was fine. The man who came into the room heard what was being said to him and asked him politely to take Mr. Jinwoo. As soon as he left, Mrs. Sellner, still trembling, began to say with fear in her voice, that he was the king and incredibly strong. She spoke in a tone full of awe and trepidation, that she wasn't sure if it was just that he had reached the national level of hunter, for there was something else there. Her voice dropped to a hushed tone. No doubt he was a king, but this young man was different from other hunters. She continued, visibly shaken. The moment she looked inside him, a cold gaze pierced through her. But it wasn't Jinwoo. An abyss, an all-consuming abyss surrounded his soul and was looking straight at him. It most likely had no limit. It was building up its strength and becoming much stronger with each passing day. At the same time, the president of the association sat in his office, his voice heavy with sorrow as he pondered why the hunter Min Ben had died. He wondered why it was the hunter, since he had retired long ago. It was a terrible tragedy, and the president's heart was breaking just thinking about it. But be that as it may, there would be many more trials ahead of them, and then things would be different. Suddenly his phone began to vibrate, and he saw that someone was calling him. As soon as he picked up, he couldn't believe his ears as he was told urgently that right now a gateway to another dimension had appeared in the middle of the road. The president of the association realized with shock that Coles was there talking troops. He decided quickly, his voice full of determination, to contact a major guild. Suddenly he realized that if the gate had indeed appeared in that area, Jinwoo previously mentioned said that it was near her guild office. However, at this time, Jinwoo deep in thought about the fact that the girl must have seen something real. She was very much startled by something, and it seemed like she saw a real monster in front of her. He began to reflect with a distant look that they probably wouldn't meet again. He sat in his car and didn't understand why there was such a traffic jam. After all, you could get home faster on the subway. Suddenly, he saw an incoming call from the president of the association. As soon as he picked up the phone, the association president began to tell him with urgency that a higher-ranking gate had opened in his neighborhood. Jin Woo's expression shifted as he realized that this gate was the reason why there was such a big traffic jam. The association president asked with some hesitation if he could settle the matter. Jin Woo, calm and focused, asked with slight amusement if he needed permission to clear it. The president began to answer. "Where does your sweet permit come from?" Jin Woo replied, his voice cool. "Do you want to know who I am in the association?" The president, realizing with a chuckle, "Then, who are you?" Jin Woo, smiling, realized that it was the president of the association, and subsequently he began to say that he may not worry about anything. Hunter Jin Woo thanked him and said with a calm resolve that he had nothing to worry about. He would take care of everything. A little while later, he was already near the gate. The cameraman filming the report exclaimed in awe that a gate appeared in front of them, right in the middle of the roadway. But Jin Woo was approaching a girl from the association. She started to stop him, saying urgently, where was he going, since outsiders were not allowed to enter? Then she paused, recognizing him. A look of surprise crossed her face as she realized she had seen this face, and it turns out to be the hunter, Jin Woo. The ordinary people watching from their cars also noticed and murmured, it was the same Jin Woo, and he must have come here to sort things out. The girl from the association asked him, her voice cautious but firm, what he was doing there, and no matter what his injuries were, she wouldn't allow him in. And if he had permission to sweep that dungeon. Jin Woo was already on the phone with the president of the association. It seemed like he wasn't exactly welcome here with open arms. He handed the phone to the girl, or rather, told her with a knowing smile to pick up the phone. She took it with confusion and asked, who is it? He responded matter-of-factly, it's the president of the association. She began to get nervous and turned around, replying quickly. Of course, she would do as she was told. But Jin Woo had already turned around and started walking into the portal. She saw this and muttered to herself with frustration to fall down and twist his ankle. Suddenly, something began to happen to the gate. It started to change color and turn red. The girl gasped, shocked. How could this happen? The gate, it's turning red. I hope it wasn't because I just said mean things to him. But Jin Woo was already inside the portal, and as he looked around, he began to realize with a sinking feeling he had been tricked. It was the red gate. He turned around, seeing that the entrance was closed, and thought to himself with a hint of concern, getting out was going to be a bit difficult. His thoughts shifted to his mother, remembering her fond words. The main thing was that he should do what he loved. He recalled how she had said there was nothing to be done if he got such a high rank. He just had to save people, like his father, who was a firefighter and saved people too. Jin Woo smiled to himself at the memory. That's why she loved him, and then they got married. He remembered his mother's advice, not to try to jump in over his head. Jinwoo began to smile after this memory, grateful, for he was so glad his mother understood him, and it was a relief to him. Feeling a sense of purpose, Jinwoo refocused. Even though he was a little frustrated, he muttered to himself, "These cities, they're complicated." But today he decided with determination, he had to finish it quickly. He began summoning all of his shadow soldiers, who started to appear around him. In front of him stood horrifying monsters, several meters tall. The shadow soldiers clashed in battle against these monsters. Jinwoo watched intently, realizing, a hunter was born to hunt, and monsters aren't their only enemies. He thought to himself with a fierce conviction, the hunter must always be on the lookout to avoid being hunted, because the situation can change at any moment. Having received a high rank, people often lose their vigilance, and no matter how many monsters fall by his hand, the hunter will never stop hunting. He reflected, even if times are hard, a hunter will always come to the aid of his friends or family, who are always near him. He concluded with a firm resolve, a hunter will never stop hunting, and so far no hunter has ever thought of stopping, even in one of the magical ruptures. In one of those ruptures where silence hung heavy, some man started breathing heavily, muttering in confusion. Why the hell was he being attacked here? A strange humanoid monster stood over him, searching desperately, trying to find some particle of light here. However, he muttered in frustration. It wasn't here, as he glanced around, realizing he had scattered them everywhere. Suddenly, the monster turned around and saw another strange man, who appeared through a portal and asked him with a sharp tone what he was doing here, and that there was a hiding place to the east of here. The newcomer added, although he himself was going to be in charge of that area, something didn't go according to plan. The first man replied cautiously, it appeared that the ruler was going to confuse them, heading a bit south. The two began speculating, their voices tense, about the Shadow Lord following a contract. One said thoughtfully, if that was the case, there shouldn't be any problems. The strange man from the portal replied that they found the brightest particle of light in that place, and that was not a bad thing. The other man approached, speaking seriously. If he was going to give in to it, he'd have to replace the Shadow Lord, and they couldn't have that puppy prowling around the world. They grumbled, wondering why he was so careless about leaving footprints. One of them muttered warily, he was not an easy kid. Suddenly, a strange man in ragged clothes approached them. He asked with an eerie calm about the little piece of land in the east that they had been talking about. The two turned to him, sneering, what do you care? They decided not to fight him, but as soon as the portal opened, they stepped toward it, adding, if he wanted to stop them, he'd have to act now. The ragged man watched them leave, steeling himself. He took a determined step forward and began to run straight at them, throwing a massive ice barrier at one of them. As they collided, a huge barrier formed, enveloping the entire area around them. Meanwhile, back in the Red Gate, Jinwoo was fighting against terrifying monsters. Eventually, he encountered a leader who spoke in a rough, human-like voice, mocking him. He was the little man who was roaming around and killing his fellow humans. The monster continued with a sneer. It would be even better for him, for not only had he personally traveled all this way, he was even speaking their language. The creature smirked confidently. However, the masters believed that now his end would come. His enemies had been waiting for him for a long time, and now they should show up right now. But suddenly, nothing happened. The monster looked around, lost, as Jinwoo asked him calmly, that was all he had to say? The monster looked amused, and Jinwoo began to command his soldiers, saying firmly, to come out. At the same moment, a massive army of shadow warriors emerged from all directions. Jinwoo observed the scene and remarked, it looked like there was no one else here. The monster couldn't comprehend what had happened. His comrades had fallen, and he stared in horror at the utter destruction around him. Shadow soldiers systematically destroyed all the monsters hiding in the bushes in ambush. At that moment, Jinwoo raised his voice, commanding his army to act. The entire dark army surged forward, advancing towards the monsters before them. They collided in a fierce battle. Some monsters, overwhelmed by fear, chose to break ranks and charge directly toward their main enemy. But what they didn't expect was a massive shadow bear appearing behind them, fighting with all its strength and scattering them in all directions. The leader of the monsters yelled in frustration. They were dumbheads, acting as if they were fighting for the first time. But before he could finish his thought, Commander-in-Chief and General Baru dispatched him efficiently. Meanwhile, Commander-in-Chief Fang began to unleash his giant song skill. After the first skill, he started to do the second skill as well and use gravitational acceleration. The big monster began to press down with all its strength against the earth. Jinwoo walked right up to him, his voice commanding, telling him to start answering questions. If he panicked, he promised that his death would come quickly and painlessly. Soon after, Jinwoo realized, with a frustrated look, that nothing seemed to be true here either. The system seems to be thwarting him in every way possible. He exhaled, calm but determined. That's okay, because one day he would still find out the truth. He looked down at the item that had fallen out of a random cursed box during the raid on the island and thought with satisfaction, now he can use this key. When his level was raised to 100, he met all the conditions. Now information about the key was available to him. It was the key to the Kartanon Temple. This key to enter the Kartanon Temple is available at the entrance, and the location of the entrance will be revealed after a certain amount of time. The remaining time is 417 hours, 6 minutes, and 52 seconds. He pondered aloud. And the key to the Kartanon Temple, Jinwoo began to think that even if he decided to look for it, it was unlikely that he would find it, since it was a dual dungeon. He sighed as he continued thinking. The system was calling him back to the place where it all began. But it was not the same as it had been before, since that was the plan. And if he's still waiting for it, in that case, he accepts its call. Let that horrible monster that once killed him wait for him to return. What happened then in that double dungeon that caused him to be reborn and start becoming much stronger? Very soon, they will meet to figure out in the end. With a grim smile, he whispered. Meanwhile, Jinho sat in his office, clicking his mouse on the desk with agitation, his face full of determination. He was deeply involved in a case to destroy the haters who were harming their guild. He didn't spare anyone trying to harm his leader. Once he finished, he sighed with relief, for he was finally able to deal with the leader's most ardent haters. At that same moment, Jinwoo walked into the room and said approvingly that he did a good job. Jinho looked up, surprised, his mouth open in shock. His master had shown up so abruptly. First he had disappeared somewhere, and now he suddenly appeared as if he had grown out of the ground. But Jinwoo asked casually that while he was away, nothing had happened. His partner replied reassuringly that everything was fine. But Jinho couldn't help noticing, with a puzzled look, that something was off with Jinwoo. He looked kind of strange, and his appearance was very messed up. Jinwoo replied, waving it off, that he had just come out of the dungeon, and since they needed money to provide for the guild, he showed the crystals in his bag. Jinho's eyes lit up with excitement. They were top-level crystals. Overjoyed, he said, now he wouldn't have to worry about the workers' salaries. But Jinho was surprised when he heard Jinwoo's words about workers. He asked, but didn't Jinwoo once mention that they needed another member? Jinho thought for a moment, recalling something, that 3 people were needed to start a guild, a director, a deputy director, and an employee. Jinwoo, however, looked a bit skeptical, not understanding the point of it. After all, it was best to hire people who were already proven. Jinho nodded but added with a serious tone that there was one more problem that they should immediately solve, the name of the guild. Jinwoo hadn't even thought about it, looking slightly taken aback, though it was indeed the most important thing. Jinho suggested, how about the Songyu Guild, in honor of their 2 founders? Or, he added with a smirk, the Yu Song Guild, although he didn't particularly like this option since his last name would come before Jinwoo's. Thinking further, Jinho suggested, or they could take the last syllables of their names and call it the Wu Guild. Or perhaps the first syllables of their names to form Jin. He chuckled. It sounded kind of good to him. But Jinwoo interrupted, suggesting with a calm confidence, how about Solo? Jinho started to get nervous, taken aback. After all, Jinwoo is a hunter who fights alone. Jinho turned around, puzzled, and thought to himself, is this some kind of joke? Should he laugh or not at this moment? After all, he thought, there are still things in the world that his mentor can't do, like working with others. He's a loner. Suddenly, a knock sounded at the door. Jinho and Jinwoo looked over, both uncertain about who it could be. As soon as they opened the door, Jinho heard a voice asking, is this the office of the Hunters Guild, Jinwoo? It was Hunter Cha. Jinwoo asked in surprise, what brought her here? She replied, smiling slightly, that she wanted to join the guild.